Aloha, friends. Welcome back once again to the Exotica Lounge for all your Exotica needs. Thank you to everyone who's been watching, listening, participating, been getting some good feedback, things that people are interested, want me to dive into, and I'm making a list and we will get there. And if you have ideas, feel free to pass those along to me. Just drop a comment down there. And speaking of, I know it's the cliche to say please like and subscribe and all that good stuff, but it is true. If you're not familiar with the inner workings of how all this works, for some reason YouTube counts higher on subscriptions, likes, comments. Those count higher than actual views as far as getting the word out and getting into the algorithms. So thank you for those of you who have subscribed and comment and all that good stuff. It is greatly appreciated. Moving on from that, I do want to give a shout out. Please do check out the latest episode from the Quiet Village podcast on digitiki.com. I'll drop a link to that down in the little place where you drop links. But the latest episode number, oh my goodness, I'm getting old. Episode 146. Episode 146. Exotica Essentials. Talking about on there, if you're just getting into Exotica music, where do you start? And he's dropping some of those essential albums that those are the ones you gotta listen to get started. And that's a great resource, and he's put together a great list there. So do check that out. Very good information. For us here at the lounge, we're going to dive back into history of what I call proto-exotica. Again, exotica basically started when Martin Denny, or his A&R guy, coined the term exotica. The prehistory would be basically going back to Les Baxter and people that drew off of his influence. It was exotica before they called it exotica. And then the proto-history is, where did Baxter get his material from, and all these other guys. So diving into this, we looked at the Latin connection last time, and now we're going to go for what I call the French connection, more generally European influence. Now, a lot of this has to be conjecture. Les Baxter didn't talk a lot about his musical upbringing, what he studied, where he came from. And he didn't explicitly state a lot of influences, although he did show some explicitly. But a lot of it has to be implied through what he wrote, what the trends were at the time, and where he came from. So take everything with a grain of salt. This is going to be my take on what I hear in the music, and from what I've studied, where things must have come from. I do want to mention part of the genius of Les Baxter is how he used and showed his influences. You will hear people talk about, in classical music, music composition, people quoting other pieces of music. And that is very often direct quoting. When we say somebody quoted from another piece, they're literally quoting. Just as an obvious example, if you go through the score to one of the Star Wars movies, you can take these measures of John Williams and say, that is these measures from Wagner. Maybe he threw it into a different key. Maybe he did something, different with it to make it his own. But he was pulling pieces out of other pieces of music. And that is considered to be not so much what you would think of as plagiarism, but really as a tribute, that these pieces of, historical importance said something. And we honor those composers by basically using a quote from them. Just like if somebody was writing a text and dropped in a quote from Oscar Wilde, they're not stealing from Oscar Wilde, they're pointing to how great he was. So a lot of classical music will quote other music that came from the past. And yeah, just John Williams is a great example because he's so prevalent. Everybody knows his music. And yeah, if you listen to the top 25 hits of classical music of all time, you start listening to, it's like, oh, John Williams used that. Oh, John Williams used that. Oh, John Williams used that. He's really just quoting these other composers and putting it into different context. Les Baxter, for the most part, did not do that. When he was drawing on an influence, instead of directly quoting what another composer did, he had this ability to just bring up a feeling of another composer. And a lot of times you'll listen to something that Baxter did, and it's like, oh, that could have been Ravel, but it's not. That could have been Debussy, but it's not. So he didn't really directly quote the way that a lot of other composers do. I'm not going to say he never did. I don't, have that kind of knowledge of either his music or classical music. But for the most part, he's drawing on his influences more as a feeling, a vibe, an overall gestalt, if you will, without directly quoting. And that really does show his mastery of writing music and being able to give a feeling, that he was taking these, not the direct musical lines that other composers wrote, but he was taking the whole schema that they would present, and then he would present it in a different way. And that, to me, is one of the most genius things that he was able to do. But again, we have to use a lot of conjecture in where his influences came from, because he's not directly quoting the way that, say, a John Williams does. So, where does all this music come from? We're going to go way, way back, all the way really to the Crusades. And it probably started even before that. But one of the tendencies, if you will, of European culture is that as they're colonializing the rest of the world, they're taking these influences of these places that they're going and somehow incorporating it into their own culture. So all the way back to the Crusades, you've got these Europeans going to what we now call the Middle East. They usually called more Asia or the Orient back then. And they're seeing this artwork, architecture, clothing, decorations, and they're hearing music. And when they come back to where they came from, they're bringing that back with them. Now, it's usually changed to some degree by the time they get there. And so that starts this other style that has been referred to as Orientalism. The picture that I'm using in the background is one of the more famous examples of Orientalism artwork. And I'm trying to keep myself centered here so that I don't get censored by the bare rear end behind me. But that was part of it. They were really saying, look at these exotic people, and this person back here with the snake wrapped around them, and this old guy, that's hard to do on camera. This old guy here is playing a flute, and then all these people, there we go, they're like sitting here listening, and look at all this decoration and stuff that they have. Isn't it very exotic and exciting? And wow, they're a totally different people from us. So some of it is very sensationalized, and that's where the claims of cultural appropriation come in, that it is very sensationalist. But in a lot of ways, it is saying, look at what these people have that we don't have, and can't we somehow incorporate this into our culture to make our culture more rich for having experienced it? So that leads to all of this interplay between different peoples. And that's really how culture progresses and advances. It's through those connections with other people. In all the various branches of art, Europeans start incorporating these other designs from these faraway places. So jumping ahead a few hundred years, we get to the 1600s. The Ottoman Empire actually made it all the way, begin to siege Vienna, Austria. In the 1700s, music started incorporating sounds from the Ottoman Empire. I always wondered, Mozart has a piece called the Turkish March. And I'm like, why is Mozart writing a Turkish march? Well, the Ottomans were just across the river playing music. So the people of Austria are hearing this. And, on one hand, this is very frightening because they're attempting to take us over. But on the other hand, wow, listen to these sounds that they have that we have never experienced before. So there was a movement in classical music to start incorporating these sounds of what were called the Janissary bands. These are the military bands of the Ottoman Empire. And they were known for making a huge racket as the troops are marching. They use a lot of metallic sounds. I've seen artwork depicting big timpani, big kettle drums, is strapped across the backs of elephants, and so they're pounding on these big kettles as elephants are marching. So to the Europeans, this was this huge racket that they had just never heard before. So even Mozart started incorporating these sounds into his music, and a lot of times it was designed to make reference to these exotic people that they are being exposed to. There is a piece called The Abduction from the Seraglio that Mozart wrote in 1782, which is considered one of the first uses of triangle and cymbals in classical music. Maybe not the first, but one of the first to really predominantly show it. And I played the overture to this, and there is a triangle just king, 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 just like all the way through the piece. It gets somewhat annoying, but that was the sound, and that's what is assaulting these people that they're not used to, is just this metallic king, 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 king. And so he used that, to great effect. And from back in those times, a lot of these pieces were just called Turkish March. So you can find Mozart, you can find Beethoven had a Turkish March. It's just everywhere. In those days, that was one of the trends that they would use. Leo Delibes, and by the way, if you thought my Spanish pronunciation was bad, hold on. It's going to get a lot worse here. I'm calling him Delibes. Leo Delibes wrote a piece called Lakme. It's an opera set in British India of the 19th century. Has a lot of Orientalist aspects. Delibes is known, he taught a student named Charles René, who then taught Ravel. And Ravel is going to be popping up quite often in this episode. So that was, back in the classical period. They start incorporating these Orientalist sounds. They're using different scales, different harmonies to try and get across this feeling of otherness and exoticism back in the day. Moving forwards to Russia in the 1860s, there was a group of composers which are referred to as the Mighty Handful. There were 5 of them. And they decided that they wanted to create a sense of Russian music, a Russian nationalist sound that they could really draw the people around. Interestingly enough, a lot of these Russian sounds were pulling from these same influences coming from the Middle East. They wanted something that sounded unique to them, but of course they're pulling in influences from other places. So they were trying to pull away from the influences of Italy and Germany predominantly. And so they start looking to the Middle East and they say, well, here's something that we can draw from that these Europeans aren't fully exploring, and we can make our own sound from that. So they were heavily relying on this sense of Orientalism. And in a lot of ways, a lot of these scales and harmonies and rhythms and instruments that they were drawing from the Middle East over time became known as more Russian sounding. They kind of popularized it so much that what normally would have been seen as coming from, in those days what they called Asia, basically became the Russian sound. And when we hear it today, a lot of times we think, oh, that sounds Russian. It came before that, it came from other places and then became Russian. So they start hanging their themes on top of this. And in a lot of ways, this looking to other cultures allowed them to write things that were maybe not considered proper in their society. They didn't have the word taboo yet, but these things maybe were considered taboo in their society. And this allowed them to introduce them by saying, oh, this is not us, it's coming from these other people. They would also draw from Russian folk music. They would use village songs, Cossack and Caucasus dances, these types of things. There would be drawing from church liturgy, chant type things, imitating the tolling of church bells and such. And they just kind of blended all this together into what they were calling a Russian sound. Some of the things that made this different from what was happening in other places in Europe, and we're going to start getting into some music theory here. I have a tendency sometimes, I tend to talk mostly to musicians using musical terms. So if I ever say something that needs a better definition, feel free to ask. If I go the other way and dumb things down too much, I apologize, but I'm trying to appeal to the greatest audience here. But some of the things that they would use were in the harmonic structures, where they would shift between keys in ways that most European composition did not do. Most of what we call classical music, European art forms, are structured mainly around the harmonic structures of the piece of music. When you look at someone like Haydn, who wrote hundreds of symphonies, how could he write that much music? It was basically a formula for him, where the harmonic structures were so codified that you're just plugging in individual notes at that point and following these systems. So they wanted to do something completely different from that. So they start playing with different ways of moving between keys that when you're coming from a system derived mainly from Bach, these things were not allowed. So they start branching out in those ways, and it feels and sounds different from what most Europeans are listening to at those times. One of the things that they would do here that, again, was generally considered against the rules are what we call parallel motion. Again, I don't want to get too much into the music theory, but under Bach's system of composition, basically, if you have two notes that are a set distance apart from each other, when you move those voices, you don't want them to be the same distance away from each other, because basically, if two voices move parallel, they disappear. So if you had two notes this far apart on the staff, you would want them to be this far apart when they move, or you want them to move different directions. So they would try to avoid these parallel motions. This Russian style of music used much more parallels, especially in intervals of fifths and fourths, which are considered bad to do in the European system. So this would really branch out into sounds and harmonics that generally just had not been heard before then, because composers actively tried to avoid them. Another thing that they would do is called heterophony. Heterophony. I'm going to go with heterophony. It's basically when a melody could be played by two or more different voices, different instruments, with different variations amongst them. So they're kind of echoing and putting variation in. Now, this is both of these things that I just mentioned are highly prevalent in exotica. A lot of times you'll hear in exotica music, an instrument will state the melody, then another instrument will come in and state the melody again, just with slight variations here and there. So they're not improvising like a jazz musician would. They're basically sticking to the same melody, but just everybody puts their own variations on it. When it comes to the parallels, looking at the writing of Baxter, he would take things, I call Baxter's writing parallel everything, where he would basically, a lot of times he would write at the piano, and he would put his hand on a chord, a set of notes, and then just move that chord up and down the piano to create a melody with this flowing harmony where everything is parallel. he would then translate that to the strings when he orchestrated it, and they're all moving in these direct parallels with each other, which again, in the European system, this was considered wrong, but he used it to great effect where it sounded exotic, and there's also a smoothness to the sound. It's almost like if you look at a guitar player and they set their hands to make a certain chord shape on the fretboard and then just start playing different chords all with that same shape. This is basically how he's writing these string parts. And it made a very distinct kind of sound that then was carried over into the smaller group Exotica music. When you look at Arthur Lyman on the vibes, he would set his mallets a certain interval apart from each other and put the melody on the high voice and then just move everything underneath that melody. So this is very different than, again, you look at jazz players playing straight ahead jazz. They tend to move these inner voices to maybe stay in more one place on the keyboard or the fretboard and move the inside voices to make all these interesting harmonies instead of just taking everything and moving it up and down the keyboard like Lyman did, like Baxter did, like the Russian Handful did. So this is one of these sounds that started all the way back in this Russian Orientalism, moved all the way forward into the modern 1950s, 1960s exotica. They would also use different scales being the collection of notes that you use in order to represent these harmonic systems. They would use, instead of the normal, what we have, 7-note do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, they would use different scales utilizing different intervals between the notes. One of those was the whole tone scale, where every note is the same distance from every other note before or after it. I'll give an example right here. The whole tone scale fits right onto the vibraphone. It's a very visual kind of scale, and the way the vibe notes interact with each other, the whole tone scale, just, you hear it and it's like, oh, that's what a vibraphone is supposed to sound like. And you'll hear this in a lot of exotica tunes, and really just a lot of times when you think what a vibraphone is supposed to sound like, you hear a whole tones. There's a piece by Combustible Edison that I think a few different people use as the intro to their podcasts, and that's what you hear in the background. It sounds mysterious and magical and sparkly, and that's the feel that they were going for by using this scale. They would also use diminished scales where notes are flatted that normally aren't, and that leads to all kinds of harmonic, interesting sounds. They would also use pentatonic scales. Pentatonic scales are used mostly in folk music, also in a lot of Asian music will use pentatonic scales. So this could give something more of a primitive type feeling. Even going back to a lot of the Neanderthal bone flutes that people have, that archaeologists have found, when they play these flutes, they're tuned to basically pentatonic scales. So they would use those in order to give this feeling of maybe an ancient type feeling or more of a tribal type feeling. And then also use it if they wanted to go for a full-on Asian type feel. A lot of Chinese and Japanese music uses pentatonic scales. I do want to point out that a couple of the composers that we're going to get more in depth with in a bit, Ravel and Debussy, French composers coming along much later, but they took a lot of inspiration from this Russian mighty handful. They would take these ideas that became Russian and start incorporating it into their French sound as well. So again, it's hearing something from another culture that seems exotic, start incorporating it into their own music, which makes it sound exotic. But then over the years, that becomes the French sound now. So we're world traveling with musical systems and styles. From the handful themselves, ones that stand out, Tchaikovsky, if you wanted to look, for the classic example in his Nutcracker, all of these dances, which are supposed to be representing people from different cultures, maybe not people with toys in this case, but yeah, he's trying to represent all these different cultures in these dances, And so he's drawing in these influences from other places, which then again all gets wrapped up into a Russian sound. Rimsky-Korsakov, one of his most famous pieces is called Scheherazade, where it's telling the story of the Arabian Nights, the 1001 Nights. And he's pulling in all these influences to make it sound exotic Middle Eastern, and that became a Russian sound. Lyman actually directly quoted Scheherazade on his Legend of Pele album. So he was taking bits and pieces of this larger work and kind of condensing them. But there's a lot of material there that could be used in an exotic kind of context. Rimsky-Korsakov also wrote the piece that's commonly referred to as the Flight of the Bumblebee. And that's been used. Martin Denny had his tune on Aphrodisia called Tsetse Fly. Again, not a direct quote, but obviously making a reference to Flight of the Bumblebee. Also, a big one to mention would be Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition, which describes all these scenes of literally, paintings that were displayed at an exhibition, and trying to musically describe all these scenes that were being portrayed in these paintings. So again, big opportunities for bringing in all these Orientalist influences and saying, oh, it's not me, it's these exotic scenes that I'm describing. Interestingly enough, going to mention Ravel again. Ravel orchestrated Pictures at an Exhibition later, took it from a piano piece into a full orchestra. He liked to do that with other people's stuff. Moving from Russia back to Germany, we pull in Wagner into the 1800s. I might not have mentioned, let me scroll up, I've got notes, which I'm not following. The Russian Mighty Handful was formed in the 1860s. Wagner was working in that same time period, so in some ways they were kind of at odds with each other. Wagner was trying to codify a German nationalist sound, for better or worse. Wagner was known as Hitler's favorite composer, but he would kind of take things in different ways, sometimes trying to get to the same result as the Russian Handful did, but coming at it from a different perspective. Basically, every composer since Wagner has been influenced by Wagner, either in that they're trying to use things that he used, or they're actively trying to not use things that he used. So whether in the pro or con category, he's an influence on basically everybody that came after. He used a lot of textures that hadn't been used before in the ways he combined instruments together. He increased the size of the orchestra itself, from coming from being a rather, small group of strings with a few winds scattered here and there, massive, huge orchestras in order to pull off Wagner's works. He's also associated with the idea of what they call a leitmotif. Again, I'm sorry for pronunciation, but basically where in his operas, the characters would be given a musical theme. So when you hear a theme, you know that character is taking part in some way. And then this could be used in creative ways, that sometimes a theme would be played where that character is not on stage. This is showing that the characters who are on stage are thinking about or referencing these characters that aren't currently on stage. Following that through again with John Williams, this is basically Star Wars. Every character had their own theme. And one of the famous examples of people who are into dissecting music, when Luke Skywalker is first looking out onto the suns of Tatooine, they're playing Leia's theme. There's some foreshadowing for you, right? He's looking to the future of this is great adventure that he's going on. So if you're really following the music, you can hear through these ideas that how these characters are interacting with each other. This basically goes back to Wagner. He also advanced the overall musical language in some ways by using what we call chromaticism, where instead of sticking to a particular scale, he's using all 12 notes and going, again, in how the Russians would move harmonically from one scale to another. He just started using all the notes, and in some ways kind of broke that system of rigid harmony by incorporating all these other tones that normally would be off limits. He would also harmonically shift the tonal centers and just throwing you into different harmonic systems. And this creates a sense of the unexpected, pulling in things of you're not really sure what's going to happen next. In a lot of ways, he brought into, this later 20th century system of what came to be called atonality, where instead of being locked into certain keys, certain notes that could be used, Schoenberg basically said all notes are given equal weight, and eventually became into this system of atonality where all 12 notes of the scale are just thrown in together, and it removes all this sense of, oh, I know where this piece is going because we haven't gotten there yet. Another thing that Wagner kind of brought into play was unresolved cadences or harmonic suspension. Most of music up to that point had been based on what's called a cadence, which is an ending to the music, where if you play what's called a 5/7 chord, it almost invariably has to resolve to the 1 chord, and now we're done. So you start at 1 is the home base, you make your way to this 5/7, and the 5/7 throws you back home again. It's been said that all classical music is basically one long continuation of 1-5-7-1. And this had been the case for hundreds of years up to this point. Wagner said, we're not doing that anymore. And so he would bring in these unresolved cadences. This is another thing that directly correlates. A lot of times exotica music does not do a 5/7-1 ending. Baxter was great at, he would throw the ending of a piece into a key that he hadn't even mentioned in the rest of the piece before, which is great. One of the things that I love, a lot of people when they're playing Quiet Village, if you know the piece, there's 2 main sections of Quiet Village, the kind of A and B, and in between there's this bridge where he goes into a different key just for about 8 bars. And a lot of people skip that because in some ways it doesn't really make sense. The people that skip that bridge also change the ending from how Baxter ended Quiet Village. If you listen to it, he ends it in the key of that bridge, where now all of a sudden it makes sense. Just again, one of those brilliant things that he would bring in. It's like you hear something, you don't know why he's doing it, but it seems to fit somehow. And by the end, it all works. Moving from Russia to Germany, now we're going to go to France. And this is kind of the bulk of the more direct influence on exotica music, is what's come to be known as French Impressionism. Interesting to note, most of the composers who are referred to as Impressionists did not agree with that term and did not like that term, much how Baxter did not like the term exotica. He said he was not an exotica composer, even though he composed all the exotica music. Most of the French Impressionists said, oh, I'm not an Impressionist, but he is. And then he was like, I'm not, but he is. So that was just a thing that they fell into. But starting with Debussy, Claude Debussy, I believe it was.
Claude.
He was alive from 1862 to 1918, so late 1800s, early 1900s. Basically, again, I said earlier, everybody has been influenced by Wagner. I found a great quote. Music critic Roger Nichols said, a list of 20th century composers influenced by Debussy is basically a list of 20th century composers. Everybody started drawing off of what Debussy did. Just to kind of outline what he was doing, where this is all coming from. I didn't write this. I'm pulling from Wikipedia here. But music critic Rudolf Resti pulled out 6 features of Debussy's music, which basically, he said, established a new concept of music in Europe. And it's really interesting to me, looking at this list, this could also be a great list of the features of exotica music in a totally different context, but the descriptions come out the same. Number 1, the frequent use of lengthy pedal points. A pedal point is basically a static bass voice in the music that everything else kind of revolves around. In exotica music, this comes across in those ostinato bass lines. Boom, 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 beam, beam. Everything else revolves around that pedal of an ostinato bass line. Second characteristic, glittering passages of webs of figurations which distract from occasional absence of tonality. Flourishes of sound, not necessarily within the same key of everything that's gone before and comes after, but just these flourishes of sound in order to give a musical effect. Exotica. Third point, frequent use of parallel chords, which are in essence not harmonies at all, but rather chordal melodies or enriched unisons. Again, this is this sense of parallel motion within the writing, where these voices aren't trying to create structured chord systems. They're just using these chords as decoration of the main melody. It's later been referred to as chord planing, also been described as non-functional harmony. That's the one that I like to use to make myself sound like a music theorist. Another feature, I've lost count of where we are, bitonality or bitonal chords, where again, using chords that are not necessarily within one key, but juxtaposing them against each other in order to give this effect of otherness and making it sound exotic. Next, we have the use of whole tone and pentatonic scales, which we've mentioned already, and unprepared modulations without any harmonic bridge. Again, this was something that Les Baxter loved to do, just automatically throwing you into a different key in order to give the feel that he wanted to, but he wasn't setting these chord changes up with a, beautifully well-prepared modulation like a classical composer would. This is also something that, when we get into the later stages of Exotica, where they would just start throwing in rhythmic or structural changes, it almost sounds like they would go through 4 or 5 different pieces of music within one piece. A lot of times these would be in different keys. Sometimes just based on what instrument was playing the melody at that time, they would just put it into a key that felt good on that instrument. But they didn't try to set it up with this well-prepared, elegant modulation to get to that other key. They would just jump into it. The conclusion being, again, in this statement, I think we were supposed to go through 6, I lost count, but the conclusion that Rudolph Reddy draws was that Debussy's achievement was the synthesis of monophonic-based melodic tonality with harmonies, albeit different, of those from harmonic tonality. So again, basically, Debussy is drawing in these notes that maybe don't fit in the classical system, but they gave it the sound that he was looking for and created a mood in order to reach the listener and help them find this place that Debussy was trying to find. Debussy was strongly, I've seen the word, preoccupied with chords themselves, and he would sometimes just structure out these collections of notes and just trying to see how they sounded against each other. When you go in and try to structure or maybe codify or name what these chords would be, they're basically, you can't say this is an A minor 7 sharp 13. It's a collection of notes that he put next to each other that he thought sounded good, and they do. And it worked, and so it created this mood that he was trying to create. And a lot of Exotica music does this. If you try to go in and do a harmonic analysis of it, it just doesn't make any sense. But these notes create a feeling with each other, and that's what the composers are going for. One of the direct references with Debussy into Exotica music that came later. In 1889, there was called the Paris Exposition Universelle, and there was a demonstration of Javanese gamelan music, which is a national style of music in various places in Southeast Asia. They do gamelan, maybe with different names. But basically, there are these metallic percussion instruments which are pitched, not pitched to scales as we know them in the West, but they were pitched, and huge ensembles playing different notes on top of each other in polyrhythms, polytonality, and it creates this very shimmery musical, magical kind of sound. Debussy fell in love with this sound, and a lot of his music after that point, he was trying to recreate the sound of gamelan music. Now, again, as things tend to go, he heard certain things and filtered those through where he had come from and what he knew, and he picked out these facets of the music that he incorporated into his music. Then everybody in Europe starts listening to it and says, oh, this is how gamelan music sounds. This is what gamelan music sounds like. It's not. It's not like you don't listen to it and think, oh, this was recorded in Southeast Asia. No, it's very French. But it was somehow influenced by these sounds that he was hearing in gamelan music. This is a point that I love to bring up because, again, as classical musicians and composers, we oftentimes will reference, oh, Debussy, he was influenced by Javanese gamelan. And we don't really look into it any more than that. It's just, that's just a known thing. He was influenced. But there's a book called Widening the Horizon, which is kind of a scholarly overview of research people have done into exotica music. And they mentioned this, and it said that somebody along the line finally had the bright idea of bringing Debussy's music to Javanese gamelan players and saying, hey, here's something that was influenced by you. And it's funny because they played Debussy's music for these Javanese gamelan players, and they said, oh yeah, that sounds like something from Cambodia. So again, these influences, when we hear something from another culture, we're going to pick up on something, and it's going to be filtered through what we know from our own experience, and that's going to change it in some way. So even though we feel like we're incorporating these elements, if you take it back to those places that you say it's from, they may not even recognize it. In my own personal experience, when I was just coming out of music school, I was introduced to the djembe drum, which is a drum from Western Africa, the Malinke people. It became hugely popular in like hippie drum circles and that kind of thing, but this was just as that was starting to take off. So I heard about this djembe and just absolutely fell in love with it. Started a decades-long deep dive into this West African system of music. But the first thing that drew me to this drum was this rich, deep bass sound that it has. And so I started playing this drum and saying, oh, I'm playing African music and throwing these deep bass sounds and everything. Because that was the thing that, stood out to me as the characteristic of this drum. As I started studying more and more about djembe music, there is very little use of the bass tone of the djembe. So to me, what I saw as the defining example of this drum was really used more as an embellishment. So again, that was my Western rock and roll jazz upbringing, was the voice that the bass plays on a drum set was not the role that it played on these djembe drums at all. So as I learned more and more about it, I had to kind of rethink how I structured what African music sounds like. Back to Debussy, around 1900, this group of French composers and artists, and in some ways maybe dilettantes, kind of sprung up around him. Basically, they were a fan club. They came to be known as the Apaches. If you look up, French Apaches, you'll find references to this gang of, thieves and murderers. That is not these guys. It was a derogatory term being used as a glib reference to them as well. These hooligans, artistic outcasts, they were referred to. But they kind of centered around the music of Debussy. He was never a member of this group. He knew members of it, but he never became a part of it. I think he thought it was kind of weird that they latched onto him this way. But Ravel, who we've mentioned several times already, and we'll talk about more to come, Ravel was a member. Also, Igor Stravinsky, who we'll be talking about later, he was a member of this group of Apaches. It was not a set group of people like the Russian Handful was, but it was kind of a club. But they kind of grew up around the music of Debussy. Another characteristic of Debussy's music that got carried over directly into exotica music was that he would sometimes use wordless vocals in his music. Not the first to do it, but he kind of made it prominent in a lot of ways. Usually a female choir singing oohs and ahs in the background instead of actual words. He used this in his piece Sirens and in the Printemps. Very Les Baxter here. You can really hear that influence in how Baxter would use his choirs a lot of times, not with actual words, but treating the voices just as another instrument within the ensemble. Another piece that falls really into the exotica category, Prélude l'après-midi d'une faune, the prelude to the afternoon of the faun. This is very exotica. He was trying to describe this scene in which a faun, which we would think of like the god Pan, half goat, half man type creature. This faun is in the woods playing his panpipes, dancing around, and he sees these passing nymphs and naiads and starts chasing after them, pursuing them unsuccessfully, and then abandons himself to just fall into a sleep filled with visions. This was originally intended to be a much larger work, but I think he lost interest and he kind of ended it early. But this is a piece that you listen to it and, man, if you would add some bird calls and bongos behind it, it would fit right into an exotica piece of music easily. It's on my list of pieces to exotify. I have done some Debussy, but I haven't done this one yet. He also had a piece called La Mer, which is, again, put a Wiro behind it, and it sounds like exotica. This one's very interesting because same kind of thing. It's the description of the sea and various things that could happen if you were upon the sea. It was somewhat groundbreaking at the time because there was really no human element to the story that he was trying to tell. He's not talking about people. He's not talking about some mythological situation. He's not really even talking about ships. It's just an impression of what it's like to be at the sea. Interestingly, when he wrote the piece, he was not at the sea. He didn't have a direct inspiration of the sea. He was actually using as his inspiration were paintings about the sea. So again, this feels very exotica to me, that he's not looking at the sea and writing a piece of music. He's looking at a painting of the sea and writing a piece of music about that painting about the sea. So it's so many steps removed from its actual object that it just has to be exotica. The program for the premiere performance of La Mer actually used this famous woodblock painting, The Great Wave off Kanagawa, just kind of showing how, yeah, he's not actually being influenced by the sea itself, but by someone else's impression of the sea. I think if I remember in all my reading into this, he actually said being at the sea is somewhat boring. So he much preferred looking at art about the sea than being there. A little note that I like to pull out too, if you listen to Arthur Lyman had a piece on Bahia called The Legend of the Rain. If you listen in the introduction, the vibraphone plays this little descending line, this is very La Mer. And one of the points that's made about La Mer is that up until that point, when talking about water or rain or anything like that, they would use arpeggiated triads, which is basically taking the notes of a chord and playing them one at a time. And Debussy didn't so much do this. He used more chromatic and linear kind of scalar type motives to give this feeling of water. Moving on from Debussy into Ravel. These two were friends. They spent a lot of time together, influenced each other greatly. Ravel was with Debussy at the exposition where they heard the Javanese gamelan. He did incorporate some aspects of that into his music as well. He's not as well known for it as Debussy was, but this was an influence for him as well. It's funny looking at these French composers, the Impressionist school especially. Most of them went to what's known as the Paris Conservatoire. They studied there, Most of them were very poor students at the conservatory. The Paris Conservatoire at the time was known for being very rigid in the old ways, the old European traditions. These guys went to this school, and they may have excelled in some aspect, but most of them were eventually kicked out because they just couldn't fit into the system, which shows they were really trying to do something new and create their own thing. It didn't fit into the old European system. So Debussy was expelled from the Conservatoire in 1895, and that's when he kind of moved from being a pianist to focusing on composition instead. Around the same time, he met Erik Satie. He and Debussy were kind of the first to kind of recognize that Satie was going to be a force in this French musical language as well. Satie, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on him, but just to make a reference, if you've ever seen the poster, a lot of people, I've got one hanging in my kitchen of this Le Chat Noir. Satie was the band leader at this Paris club. So that's where a lot of the composers of the day would know him. And a lot of his music translates directly to Exotica. One of my favorite pieces to play is a Satie piece that I really just kind of pulled out from the piano and put it on the vibraphone. And again, put a güiro and bongos behind it, and it feels just like Exotica. But back to Ravel. In the 20s, again, where he met Satie, he's hanging out in these Parisian cafes, which was where a lot of music was being developed, and they were bringing in jazz influence in a lot of ways, and Ravel got very interested in jazz music. A lot of times when we listen to it today, we don't really hear jazz when we hear Ravel, because jazz has kind of gone in a completely different direction at this point. But he saw this as a great influence. So he's hanging out in these cafes, talking to jazz musicians, and these elements are coming into his music as well. Interesting, this is going to be another one of my diversions here. A couple things all came together at once here, and I was introduced to Leo Arnaud, who had a pre-Exotica album really following in Les Baxter's footsteps. A lot of times we see it called Marambita. The original title of the album was The Spectrosonic Sounds. I think it's been released several times under different names, but if you have a Leo Arnaud album that is Exotica, it's all the same album. So unless you're like a collector, you don't really have to get all of them. It's the same music. Leo Arnaud was a trombonist. Originally, he was in France. He knew Ravel. They got to know each other fairly well as Ravel is exploring jazz music. Arnaud would kind of get together with him and teach him about it. Ravel's most famous piece is called Bolero, and we're going to talk about it more to come. But Bolero is basically, again, this is a mood piece. He was trying to get an idea across, not so much tell a story, but create an atmosphere. Basically, for every member of the orchestra, Bolero is a famous, what we call an excerpt. It's a little snippet that you're going to be asked to play on an audition. The snare drum part of Bolero, it plays the same rhythm. It's something like 150 times. You just play the same rhythm over and over and over and over. It's a 15-minute piece. It starts with the snare drum playing this rhythm, and it just does it the whole time, which is brutal to do. Basically, all these different instruments play the same thing that the snare drum is doing. There's a little motif that gets played, bounced around to different parts of the orchestra over and over. The trombone section, when they play the motif, it's a little bit different in there because they use the slide and do glissandos that other instruments can't really do. Arnaud worked on this part of Bolero with Ravel. Arnaud said that Bolero was originally in a different key. And Arnaud said, if you want this on trombone, you have to put it in this key so that we can do these glissandos between these notes. And so he ended up having to repitch the whole thing to fit the trombone part in there. So it's a famous excerpt for trombones. Very interesting to me, I found somebody had done their graduate thesis on Arnaud. There's a statement from him where he says the way most people play the trombone part of Bolero is incorrect. he worked with Ravel on the writing of it, and I believe he played the premiere, but it was like a small premiere, and then there was a bigger one later, and he wasn't available because he's working in a jazz band and he had a gig. He couldn't make that one. Somebody else came in and play it, and they knew it was supposed to sound like jazz, so it's supposed to have these glissandos in there, and the player who was doing that performance wrote in more glissandos than Arnaud had put in order to give it a jazz feel. Again, very exotica. I want it to have this feeling. I don't really know what that is, but this is what it means to me. So he put in all these glissandos, which are what make it difficult to play. There's these weird glissandos that kind of almost don't fit. Arnaud said most of those were not supposed to be there. But he wrote them into the part, and that was the one that got used when the piece was published. That's the one that they wrote it from. So whoever was copying it saw those notations and said, oh, these were supposed to be there, and they put it into the official version. So Arnaud has a different version that doesn't have all those glissandos. There's some, but not as many. Arnaud ends up going to America later. He put out an Exotica album, which is great. It's a very good album, very much worth being in your collection if you're an Exotica collector. It's on YouTube and the streaming services as well if you just want to hear it. His big claim to fame, he wrote the Olympic theme. I always thought John Williams wrote that. John Williams wrote a lot of other music that's used at the Olympics, but when he did his rewrite, they were like, this theme is too good, we're going to keep it. So the actual Olympic theme, this was Arnaud, going back to the Ravel connection. Okay, now we're going to come off of that tangent, back to Ravel. Anyway, now I've completely lost where I was. Oh yeah, so Ravel, Bolero, it's his most famous piece. As is the way with such things, Ravel did not really care for it. There's actually a great quote from him where he says, I've written only one masterpiece, Bolero. Unfortunately, there's no music in it. And that's kind of the thing. It's basically a long orchestral crescendo. It starts very soft, and at the end it is hugely loud. I've played this twice. I didn't do the snare drum part, but I was doing bass drum and gong. And the first time I played it, they wanted it so loud, I actually managed to knock the gong off the back of the stage. That's my claim to fame. Bolero ends up being hugely successful, and it is one of these pieces that is quoted over and over and over and over again. One of my favorite in the Exotica sphere. And again, this is Baxter not quoting, but drawing an influence from. One of his pieces, The Mighty Galleons, has a snare drum going all the way through it. And again, you hear this piece and you say, oh, he's quoting Ravel. And then you look at the actual notes. He's not quoting Ravel at all. This is a completely different rhythm, but it has the same feel that Ravel brought about in Bolero. So this is one of those things where Baxter could quote someone without quoting them, and absolutely make it his own. And then I quoted Baxter in one of my pieces. I took that rhythm, and diving into it, looking at the rhythm that Baxter uses is very interesting to me, because if you really dive into it, the rhythm that you're hearing, to me, the rhythm that I hear when I hear this piece is not the rhythm that's being played. And that's a whole nother topic, but he implies some notes in the snare drum rhythm that, you know, when you listen back to it just in your mind, you think, oh yeah, this is the thing that you're playing, and then you go and listen to the notes, and it's like, oh, that's not actually what he was doing. It's very cool how he, there's all these implications in this piece that you go back and listen to it, and it's like, oh, number one, no, that's not Bolero. He didn't directly quote it. And then number two, this thing that I'm quoting that he did, that's not actually what he did either. So, very cool piece. I think I was supposed to come off of a tangent and went right back onto another tangent. That's fine. Ravel, overall, to sum him up, brought in some real great developments in orchestration, which is how you take the music and which instruments play which parts. He really transformed orchestration in a lot of ways. Wrote a book on it. So a lot of people draw their influence in orchestration from Ravel. Also, he would take other people's pieces and reorchestrate them himself. So a lot of the more famous pieces are not actually the composer's piece. It's how Ravel voiced those later. He also, he used these same systems with using different scales and different harmonies, modalities, which gave a very exotic feel, where he was really trying to evoke emotions through orchestral color, and say, by blending these sounds together, it creates this feeling in the listener. And really, listening to Ravel, you can see a direct influence on later film composition, which again, Les Baxter was a film composer. So you can really hear in his music that he was drawing from this. And also, on a direct statement, a lot of people who knew Les Baxter personally said, a lot of times he would just sit down at the piano and start playing, and he was most likely to, if he wasn't playing his own music, which he would do frequently, he was probably either playing Debussy or Ravel. So we do fairly well know that these were huge influences in his work as well. Moving on from there, more in this French Impressionist style of music, which they all said they were not Impressionists. Saint-Saëns, I mentioned Satie. Ducasse is a big one as well. We don't know a lot of the music of Ducasse because he was highly perfectionistic, and basically he destroyed most of his own music. He was never satisfied with what he wrote, so a lot of it he would burn so that nobody would play it because he just didn't feel like he got where he was going. It's interesting, Ducasse was a music critic. That was his main job, and it's one of those things, it's like, oh, well, if you know so much about it, why don't you do it? And he would compose music, and he was his own harshest critic as well, so he would destroy it. However, he was a student at the Paris Conservatoire. He was a student with Debussy, and they became close friends. So there's got to be some influences going back and forth there. He later taught Messiaen, who we're going to talk about in a moment. He also taught Walter Piston. Walter Piston, if you studied music at all, you probably have Piston's books on your bookshelf. He wrote books about harmony, harmonic analysis, orchestration, and counterpoint, and these books are still in use in colleges today. So again, hugely influential, a student of Ducasse. We know Ducasse mostly today through The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which, if you don't know it by that title, it was in Disney's Fantasia, kind of the main piece of Fantasia. This is the one where Mickey Mouse is the sorcerer's apprentice, and the sorcerer tells him, clean up the joint while I'm away. Well, why don't I use magic to do it? And things, hilarity ensues. Basically, when he wrote the piece, that was the story. It was inspired by a poem or a story, and that was the story. So Disney basically just made Mickey Mouse the character in it. Listening to this is another one of those, it's French Impressionism. Put some bongos and bird calls behind it. It would fit right onto an Exotica record easily. I've got a long list. I'm probably going to do an album someday of just French Impressionist pieces rewritten as Exotica. And hopefully they're all in public domain, so I don't have to pay a lot of money to do it. He also had a ballet called La Paris, which is about a Persian prince in search of the lotus flower of immortality. And if that's not Exotica, I don't know what is. Moving from Ducasse to Messiaen, he was one of Ducasse's students. He was known for a lot of things, but he incorporated ancient Greek rhythms, Hindu rhythms, Balinese and Javanese gamelan again, Japanese music, and most interesting to me, bird song. He would actually go out, into the fields and forests and listen to the birds and transcribe those. He would write down the notes that the birds are singing, and he would incorporate that into his music. So again, Exotica musicians are making bird calls. Messiaen did it as well, just not vocally. He did it with the instruments. He's also known for, he had synesthesia, where he would hear music and see colors, vice versa. And he came up with this whole system of music that was based around color, which nobody else can actually replicate because colors don't mean the same things to other people. Even among people who have synesthesia, they'll see different colors for the same music. So it's really, he came out, it's like, oh, this is blue and this is green. Nobody really knows what that means. Feels like Exotica to me. From there, last composer that I want to mention, moving out of the French school, really, we've got Stravinsky. And he was alive from 1882 to 1971. So, covering a very interesting time period. Think about being born late 1800s and living to 1972. He saw some incredible advances happen, just in the world. Music, though, completely different from, when he was born to where he died. He was in this time period where he got to meet some of these people that we've already talked about. He was a friend of Vladimir Rimsky-Korsakov, who was the son of Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, who was one of these Russian mighty handful. So he got to meet Nikolai as well, and he actually brought him some of his music, and Rimsky-Korsakov agreed to personally advise him. He wasn't, a direct teacher, but he would give him advice about what to do with his pieces. He heard these, chamber works of Franck, Ducasse, Fauré, Debussy, all these people, he was right there in that same world, just coming a little bit later, and was influenced by them and started, incorporating some of the things that they were bringing to their music. He did as well, and then took it even beyond that. After Rimsky-Korsakov died in 1908, Stravinsky began working with, he's known as the impresario, Sergei Diaghilev. He was presenting Russian music in Paris. So Stravinsky ends up going to Paris as well and writing ballet for Diaghilev. This is where he came up with the Firebird. This was basically, I believe it was actually the idea for the ballet came first, and then Stravinsky came up with this music to represent this Firebird. At the premiere, he met Debussy, and Debussy was a huge fan. He said, this is you're doing things. You're going to go somewhere. Firebird just kind of blew people away. His use of rhythm and orchestration and tonal colors just absolutely blew people away. Still huge, even to this day. I can't count how many times I've played Firebird because people just love it. So yeah, huge piece of music. While he was writing Firebird, he came up with the idea for what became the Rite of Spring. Rite of Spring, if Firebird was big, Rite of Spring just absolutely blew everybody away. You may have heard stories about, riots at the premiere. It's true. This piece was so huge that people actually just, went out into the streets and started, as they do in Paris. When they don't know what to do, they start throwing bricks and burning things. So this is what happened with the Rite of Spring. It was just absolutely huge. Nobody knew what to do with this piece of music, and absolutely changed what was possible for music to be. And then, direct influence here. Again, you go into this piece of music, The Ritual of the Savage by Les Baxter. As far as I know, there's nowhere on this record where he directly quotes the Rite of Spring. But there's no way that you can listen to this and say it's not influenced by it. And I believe I've heard it attributed, at least, that Baxter said this was his Rite of Spring. And he wanted it to be that big. And in a lot of ways it was. Nobody rioted, but it was a huge impact on the music that came after him. Even among people that didn't know that that's where the influence came from. It filtered through other voices as well, but really changed music since then. So that really brings us, full circle into Exotica, all the way from, where did we start was, we went all the way from the Knights Templar all the way to the Rite of Spring. So in a nutshell, that's an overview and a very brief, as long as this has been, that's been a brief overview, because in researching all this, I kept getting drawn into all these different tangents where all of these composers were all interconnected, and there are so many other that I didn't even bring up in here. But there's all these little snippets, and none of them exist in a vacuum. Everybody was drawing influences from each other, both from the past and people that they were contemporary with, and all working together to advance what they saw as the art of music. And Les Baxter was the continuation of that advancement. And then what we know as Exotica today, what Martin Denny did, he took it in a completely different direction, making everything into a small group. But again, he was seeing that as the advancement of this music. And so it keeps on moving forwards. And then today we're still trying to advance the music as well, and advance the culture from there. So that's going to be the end of that section for me on what I call proto-exotica. I'm sure we're going to come back and reference to it again many, many times. But for now, that's going to be a day at the Exotica Lounge, and we'll pick it back up from there again next time. Aloha.